We all want to feel like we're connected to something or someone. It's a part of being human. It's like this need to belong is woven into our DNA. It's also human to embrace the familiar and the routine and what's comfortable. And it's that embracing of the familiar that can sometimes stand in the way of us not only creating space or a sense of belonging for ourselves, but also for others. Now, this reminds me of a story that happened not long ago when my family and I attended a culture festival right here in my hometown of Chattanooga, Tennessee. This was a beautiful day. There were vendors, there was food, and there was music. And my daughter was with me. And there are two things you need to know about my daughter. First, she loves music. And second, she never meets a stranger. So when she saw this group of kids dancing, holding hands in a circle, I knew and she knew that she had to be a part of it. So she ran right over to extend her hand. This little black girl looked up and she made eye contact with this little white girl. And I will tell you, as a father, when she immediately didn't take her hand, my reaction was, this little girl better grab my daughter's hand. I will tell you, I was filled with anxiety, but a moment passed and she did grab my daughter's hand. They enjoyed each other and had a great time together. I'll tell you this, when I look back at this moment, there are three observations that come to mind. And really, they help me define inclusion, but they also can help us better understand our own inclusion journey. The first observation is this, that at one point in time, we're all like my daughter, putting ourselves out there, wanting to be connected to something bigger. The second observation is we're like this little girl. We use our power, our position, and our privilege to pull someone in and create a space for belonging. But more likely than not, or more often than not, you're like me. I was an observer, yes, but I was still filled with anxiety from years and years of cultural and social conditioning. Filled with those emotions of when I was turned away, thinking about when I was rejected because of race or discrimination or bias. And all too often, these emotions of rejection, coupled with this desire to be comfortable, to embrace the familiar, can stand in our way of actually creating belonging and authenticity for ourselves. So unfortunately, the reality is we can't help it. It can be difficult at times because of something called bias. This is as a result of that social and cultural conditioning. Now, bias can show up in many different ways. It can show up when you're making hiring decisions and you hire someone that looks and reminds you of yourself. That's called similarity bias. But it can also show up when you are talking to someone. These things are called micro messages. So when someone comes to me and say, Wade, you're so articulate, or I don't see color, or when women hear things like, you should smile more, or you're too emotional. The unfortunate part is when it comes to bias, it can be both intentional and unintentional. And most of our decisions, in fact, studies show that 99% of our decisions fall into the unconscious bias category. So what can we do to prevent bias from impacting our decisions? For me, I'll come up with 3 questions that I'd like to share with you today that's been helpful for me, not only to disrupt my bias, but to make sure I'm making more impact in not only how I lead, but how I live. Now, this first question is whether I'm actually leaning in to better understand someone else's unique experience. Now, this question for me gets right to the heart of disrupting bias because it requires action. And for me, that action means things like taking training or attending a workshop, reading a book or an article, or just watching a documentary. But what I found to be the most impactful way to disrupt bias and really lean in is by sitting down and listening to individuals, their unique experience and perspective. Because when I do that, I'm doing exactly what Brian Stevenson said, which is getting proximate. Now, we witnessed a great deal of this during the summer of 2020. After the murders of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and the many tragic incidents that took place during this year, I saw a lot of my white coworkers and friends lean in a way to better understand the experience of Black Americans. What I also saw was them wanting to be more intentional about how they could be better allies and ultimately advocates for the Black community. For us, I will tell you, it's important that we understood the dimension of diversity that Black Americans face, but there are other dimensions of diversity as well. So we need to better understand how the challenges of the workplace are impacting women. We have to better understand how bias might show up with members of the LGBTQ community or someone that is over the age of 60 or veterans. What I challenge you to do is make sure you're leaning in to understand those different dimensions of diversity. Now, while engaging others, we know that bias can show up. It also can show up with how we make decisions. So the second question I have for you is, am I making room for voices to be present other than my own? Now, this question gets right to the fact of how can I make decisions that are rooted in fairness and equity if I don't have different perspectives of those I'm making decisions for in the room? What we know is this is a part of how I operate, but I have to be intentional about it. Otherwise, I'm going to fall into the category of embracing the familiar and the routine. This explains why companies and organizations and communities oftentimes miss the mark because they don't have that diversity around the table. And those who are making the decisions are just a select few. Now, it's important that we bring voices around the table, but it's also important that we think about this third question, which is whether I'm creating space for others to be their authentic selves. Now, when I ask this question, I immediately think of Verna Myers. Verna is an inclusion strategist, and she made the famous statement, diversity is like being invited to the party, but inclusion is being asked to dance. I would actually take it a step further and say belonging, a culture of belonging, is like being able to dance with your own unique style. When I think about those kids that day, I think about the fact they were dancing all to the same music, all to the same beat, but each of them had their own unique style. They allowed each other to have and experience their authentic selves together. Now, to create this kind of authentic environment in our own lives, it requires courage and vulnerability because we have to be authentic ourselves. And as leaders, we want to make sure that we're putting ourselves out there and understanding that we might not know all the answers, that we don't have to show up perfect, but we do need to show up, that at times we're not going to know the right thing to say. But we're there to listen and to be empathetic and to be vulnerable and to be courageous. Now, I will say this, for these three questions, these are questions that are helpful for me in interrupting or disrupting my bias. You may have questions that work for you. And as you advance your inclusion journey, I'm sure you'll think of more. But what I'll tell you is this, interrupting your bias is hard work. And on your inclusion journey, you might not get it right every time, but that's okay. You have to make space for your own grace. Now, when I think back to that day with that festival, I think about the kids, I think about the fact that I always try to be a good role model for my daughter. Not perfect, but at least passing along lessons that she can use for years to come. But on this day, at that festival, I think that she wasn't really there to learn from me, not with my anxiety, not with all the conditioning that I was experiencing. Maybe, just maybe, I was there to learn from her and from the other kids. They were putting themselves out there, creating a space of belonging, not just for themselves, but for each other. My challenge for you is to make sure you're asking these three questions about leaning in and understanding someone else's experience, giving voices to be heard and be present in the room, but also creating space for people to be their authentic selves. But that starts by all of us putting ourselves out there and extending our hands. Will you join me? Thank you.